Somewhere on the Great Plains, in a single afternoon, a community could end up with 50 or more dead bison on the ground, close to 20,000 pounds of meat, and maybe 48 hours before most of it started rotting in the summer heat. No salt, no ice, no way to freeze anything, no tin cans, no root cellar with a compressor humming inside it. And somehow, that meat didn't rot. People dried it, smoked it, buried it, and packed it onto horses to carry across a continent, making it last for years instead of days. The system behind that was so valuable that in 1814, two of the most powerful trading companies in North America went to actual war over who got to control it. Not over land or gold, over meat. Here's how it actually worked. That 20,000 pounds didn't come from a slow, steady hunt. It came from something called a buffalo jump, and it's worth picturing for a second. A young runner, usually the fastest in the group, would disguise himself in a bison calf hide and lure a herd toward a cliff edge, mimicking the sound of a distressed calf, while other hunters fanned out behind the animals in a wide V, waving robes and shouting to keep them moving in the right direction. Stone cairns lined the path the whole way, forming what's basically a funnel the bison couldn't see past. By the time the lead animals realized a drop was coming, the herd behind them was already moving too fast to stop. At a site like Head Smashed in what's now southern Alberta, this exact method was used for roughly 6,000 years. A single successful jump could bring down 50 to 200 animals in one event, and the bones are stacked more than 30 feet deep in places from centuries of repeated use. This wasn't one nation's secret. At the Madison Buffalo Jump in Montana, archaeologists have traced use back through more than a dozen different peoples over time, including the Hidatsa, Shoshone, Lakota, Crow, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet, sometimes hunting the same cliff in the same general era. Where the land wasn't right for a cliff, the Plains Cree in particular favored a different version of the same trick. They'd build a timber corral, drape it in dark hides so the animals saw nothing but solid wall on every side, and drive the herd inside through a funnel that stretched for miles. Once the bison realized they were trapped, they didn't break out. They just circled, confused, in a fence flimsy enough that a determined animal could have knocked it flat. They never tried. None of this happened casually either. Before a hunt like this, many Plains nations held ceremonies asking the buffalo's spirit for permission and giving thanks afterward, and almost nothing went to waste out of respect as much as necessity. The hide became tipi covers and winter robes. The sinew became thread and bowstring. The horns and bones became tools, and a typical northern plains lodge needed somewhere between 12 and 20 separate hides just for the covering. So that's the actual scale of the problem nations across the plains were solving for. Not a deer for dinner, a literal mountain of meat, fat, hide, and bone that had to be saved before the next sunrise made most of it worthless. The moment a hunt like that ended, the real race began. Women moved in immediately to butcher the animals, working in something close to an assembly line, and they weren't choosing cuts at random. Hunters specifically targeted cows for most of the year because they carried more fat than bulls, and fat was the entire point. Bones were cracked open and boiled down for marrow grease. Hides were staked out and scraped, and the meat itself got cut into long, thin sheets, almost as wide as the animal, but barely thicker than a finger. That thinness wasn't an accident. The thinner the strip, the more surface area exposed to air, and the faster the moisture could escape. The strips went up on wooden racks in the open sun, sometimes with a low fire underneath if the weather wasn't cooperating, and the wind that constantly moves across the Great Plains did the rest of the work for free. Within a day or two, meat that would have rotted by the following afternoon had turned into something close to leather. That's not folklore, that's basic food science. Bacteria need water to survive and reproduce, and once enough water is pulled out of meat, there's nothing left for them to use. It's the same principle a dehydrator in your kitchen runs on today. The difference is that Plains nations were running that exact process at the scale of an entire winter's food supply, using nothing but wind, sun, and good timing. But dried meat alone created a new problem. It was tough, it was bland, and on its own, it still didn't carry enough calories to fuel someone hauling gear across hundreds of miles of open prairie in the dead of winter. Drying solved spoilage. It didn't solve nutrition or portability. Therefore, the next step wasn't really about preserving food anymore. It was about engineering it. That next step produced something most viewers have probably heard of, even if they've never known where the word came from. Pemmican. It comes from the Cree word pimmi, meaning fat, and it describes exactly what's inside. The dried meat got pounded down with stones or a wooden mallet until it was almost a powder, then mixed with rendered fat, including the soft marrow grease and the harder fat along the animal's back, sometimes with dried berries like chokecherries or saskatoons folded in. The ratio mattered. Too little fat and the mixture wouldn't hold together or carry enough energy. Too much and it spoiled faster. Done right, the fat didn't just bind the mixture together. It sealed it, coating every particle of dried meat and physically blocking the oxygen that triggers rancidity at a molecular level. No oxygen reaching the fat, no oxidation, no spoilage. It's the exact same reason vacuum-sealed food lasts longer in your fridge right now. Just achieved with rendered tallow instead of a plastic bag and a pump. The result was absurdly stable. Packed into a rawhide pouch called a parfleche, often folded like an envelope and painted with bold geometric designs specific to the maker's family or nation, pemmican could last for months without any extra effort, and well-documented accounts describe batches still good after years. Pound for pound, it carried roughly the calories of a modern energy bar, except it was made entirely from what one animal and one growing season provided. No farms, no packaging plants, no supply chain. It was good enough that, a century later, polar explorer Robert Peary credited it as essential equipment on his North Pole expeditions in an era when ships had iceboxes and tin cans already existed. He still chose pemmican because nothing else packed that much usable energy into that little weight. And once people realized how well it traveled, pemmican stopped being just a survival food. It became an economy. Métis and Cree producers across what's now the Canadian prairies made it by the thousands of pounds and sold it to fur trading companies who depended on it to feed crews paddling deep into the interior, far from any farmland. It wasn't only eaten dry either. Travelers often broke pieces of it directly into boiling water to make a thick, fast stew, turning a brick of preserved fat and protein into something closer to a hot meal in minutes, no cooking equipment required beyond a pot and a fire. By the early 1800s, pemmican wasn't a backup plan, it was critical infrastructure. Which is exactly why, in January of 1814, a colonial governor named Miles MacDonell did something that should sound insane on paper. He banned it. He issued what's now called the Pemmican Proclamation, blocking anyone from exporting pemmican out of the Red River district in an attempt to protect food supplies for a struggling new colony. The Métis and the Northwest Company, who relied on that pemmican to survive and to run their entire supply chain, had no intention of losing it over someone else's proclamation. Within months, 500 bags of pemmican, 96 kegs of rendered grease, and 9 bales of dried meat were seized from a single trading post. More raids followed on both sides. Tension built for 2 years until June of 1816, when a Métis leader named Cuthbert Grant and a Hudson's Bay Company governor named Robert Semple ran into each other near what's now Winnipeg, both with armed men behind them. Within minutes, gunfire broke out. Semple and 20 of his men were dead by the time it ended. Who actually goes to war over dried meat? 2 of the most powerful trading companies on the continent burned years and lives fighting over who got to control a food system that one group had already perfected long before either company existed. If stories like this, the ones connecting something as ordinary as a snack to something this much bigger, are your thing, we dig into them every week. Subscribe if that sounds good. But the plains weren't the only place this problem got solved, and bison weren't the only animal at the center of it. On the other side of the continent, on the rivers and coastlines of what's now Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska, nations like the Suquamish, the Tlingit, and the Chinook were dealing with a completely different version of the same clock, and they had to catch the fish before they could even think about preserving it. Communities built wooden weirs and basket traps across rivers to intercept salmon during the run, sometimes timing the harvest around ceremonies that thanked the fish for returning. Since the relationship wasn't purely transactional, the salmon were understood as something closer to a guest the community depended on, and the run itself only lasted a few weeks each year, in numbers that could overwhelm a river before slowing to nothing again until the following season. Miss that window, and there's no second chance until next year. So, instead of relying on sun and open air the way plains nations did, coastal peoples built smokehouses, often framed in cedar planks, chosen specifically because the wood resists rot in a region that's damp for most of the year, and kept fires burning inside them for days at a stretch, sometimes for a full week without letting the flame die. A single good run, properly caught and properly smoked, could provide the bulk of a community's protein for the entire year, which is exactly why getting the process right wasn't optional. Alder wood was the preferred fuel in a lot of these communities, prized for the steady, cool smoke it produced rather than a hot blaze. The fish hung above the fire, never directly over flame, slowly losing moisture while the smoke worked its way into the flesh. Imagine being the person whose entire job for a week straight is making sure that fire never goes out. Here's the part that's easy to miss if you think of smoke as just a flavor. It's also chemistry. Wood smoke is loaded with compounds called phenols, along with organic acids, and those compounds are actively hostile to the bacteria that cause food to spoil. Modern food science has confirmed what coastal nations clearly already understood through generations of trial and error. Smoking isn't just drying with extra steps. It's drying combined with a low-grade antimicrobial treatment, layered on top of the same water loss principle driving dried meat on the plains. Different geography, different animal, a different exact technique, but the same underlying science, discovered independently and applied with total precision. And keeping that fire going for a week wasn't a side detail. It was the job. Someone had to check it constantly, day and night, because letting it die out partway through meant losing the entire batch. That kind of knowledge doesn't survive by accident. It survives because people pass it down on purpose, and at places like the Suquamish tribe's Chief Kitsap Academy in Washington, that's exactly what's still happening. Elders are teaching teenagers how to read smoke, tend a fire for days straight, and finish a batch the same way their great-grandparents did. There was a third tool in all of this, and it's the one the title of this video is technically arguing against, but it deserves its own moment. Cold. Just not the kind that comes out of a machine. Further north, where the ground itself stays frozen for most or all of the year, Arctic peoples didn't need to build anything to get refrigeration. They just needed to dig down to it. Communities along the Bering Strait carved cellars straight into the permafrost, sometimes called sigluak, that held a steady, reliable freeze without a single watt of electricity. Drop meat down there, and the ground did exactly what a freezer does, just for free and forever. On the northern plains, winter created a rougher version of the same advantage. Once temperatures dropped and stayed there, meat left outside simply froze solid on its own, no pit required, turning the coldest, harshest part of the year into the easiest season for keeping food edible. Drying, smoking, and freezing all bought time. But there was still the question of where everything went once it was ready, and the answer, across an enormous range of climates and cultures, kept coming back to the same idea. Put it underground. In the northeastern woodlands, nations like the Haudenosaunee and Algonquin dug pits lined with bark or woven mats, sometimes 6 feet deep, to keep dried meat, corn, beans, and nuts safely below the frost line. The Haudenosaunee paired specific plants with specific foods inside these pits, layering sumac leaves with squash and hemlock branches with corn, using the natural compounds in the plants themselves as an extra line of defense against decay. In the southwest, Puebloan communities built underground storage chambers connected directly to their living spaces, sometimes sealed with clay to control moisture, using the steady insulation of the earth to hold a stable temperature through brutal seasonal swings between scorching days and freezing desert nights. Dried meat shared space with corn, beans, and squash, and the dry climate of the region did a lot of the preservation work on its own, since there was barely enough humidity in the air to support mold or bacteria in the first place. And in 2024, archaeologists working near Anchorage, Alaska, uncovered something that put an actual number on how long this had been going on. A cache pit used by Dena'ina and Athna peoples, lined with birch bark and grass, dug roughly 3.5 feet into well-drained soil. Radiocarbon testing came back at nearly 1,000 years old, still holding the remains of preserved moose and caribou. Yeah, you read that right. 1,000 years. That's not a clever trick someone stumbled into once. That's an engineering tradition, refined and passed down so consistently that it was still being used the exact same basic way for an entire millennium. It's worth being precise here, because it matters. This wasn't one culture with one trick. It was hundreds of distinct nations, each with their own language, their own territory, and their own specific relationship to the animals around them, independently running variations on the same core experiment for thousands of years before anyone wrote any of it down. The Lakota perfecting bison weren't coordinating with the Suquamish perfecting salmon. The Haudenosaunee weren't taking notes from the Dena'ina. Each solution grew out of its own land, its own climate, and its own animals, which makes the fact that they all converge on the same underlying chemistry even more striking. Put all of it together. The wind-dried meat on the plains. The pemmican that started a war. The week-long smokehouse fires on the coast. The permafrost cellars and winter freezes further north. The underground pits buried below the frost line. A pattern starts to show up. None of these were random workarounds. Each one was a precise response to a specific local problem. Too much meat, too little time, the wrong climate for any single universal fix. Different nations across the continent, often with no contact with each other at all, arrived at solutions built on the exact same scientific principle that food scientists only got around to formally naming water activity, sometime in the 20th century. Funny enough, the word everyone associates with all of this jerky doesn't even come from North America. It traces back to charqui, a Quechua word from the Andes meaning roughly to dry or burn meat, carried north by Spanish colonizers centuries later and gradually reshaped into the word we use now. The technique long predates the word, and the two traditions developed almost completely independently, an ocean of distance and centuries of separation apart. Yet they landed on nearly identical solutions, because the underlying problem, water plus warmth equals spoilage, never changes, no matter where you are. And none of this is locked away in the past, treated like some lost art that died out with the last buffalo herd. The same methods that kept entire nations fed through brutal winters are still being taught and still being practiced right now in kitchens, in community programs, and in tribal colleges by people who never stopped doing it. Channels like Indigenous Kitchen post traditional pemmican recipes for anyone curious enough to look, using the same dry meat, same berries, same rendered fat their ancestors used, just on camera instead of in secret. Tribal members with roots stretching from Idaho to New York are teaching the exact same ratios their grandmothers used. This was never a museum exhibit. It's a living skill set that happens to be thousands of years old. So here's something worth sitting with. Every one of those systems had to work perfectly, every single time, with zero margin for a refrigerator to fall back on if something went wrong. No backup plan, no grocery store down the road. Could you build something that reliable, using nothing but wind, smoke, fire, and dirt? This started with a mountain of meat and 48 hours on the clock. It ended with a war, a 1,000-year-old hole in the ground, and a food system precise enough to run on for an entire year, with nothing modern involved at all. There's another one queued up on screen if you're not done yet.